The emergency klaxon that screamed across Galactic University's dormitory complex at exactly 1800 hours was the kind of sound that made even the most battle-hardened species reach for their prayer beads. Deep, resonant, and absolutely unmistakable in its message. Something had gone catastrophically wrong. Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Security Chief Zulvex was enjoying what passed for coffee in his species, a bitter green sludge that could strip paint, when his communication device erupted with enough urgency to make his 4 eyes water. The message was brief, precise, and exactly the kind of nightmare that kept security chiefs awake during their rest cycles. 3 Nightstalker cubs escaped. Location unknown. Consider extremely hostile. Now, for those blissfully unfamiliar with Nightstalkers, allow me to paint you a picture. Imagine taking a panther, feeding it nothing but rage and violence for several months, then giving it opposable thumbs and the intelligence of a chess grandmaster. Then make it twice as fast, 3 times as strong, and give it claws that could slice through reinforced steel like it was tissue paper. Oh, and make sure it hunts in packs, because apparently the universe has a sense of humor. These were cubs, baby Nightstalkers, which, in the grand cosmic joke of evolution, were only marginally less deadly than the adults. Zulvex's mandibles clicked in what his species considered a curse as he activated the campus-wide emergency protocol. Within minutes, the dormitory complex transformed from a peaceful academic environment into something resembling a military installation under siege. Emergency barriers slammed down over windows. Corridor lights shifted to the harsh red of combat readiness. And somewhere in the distance, the distinctive whine of charging plasma weapons began to fill the air. The security chief's first stop was the zoology department, where he found Dr. Vexthul, a thin, nervous creature from the spiral arm colonies, practically vibrating with panic. "How?" Zulvex asked, with the kind of calm that suggested he was about 2 seconds away from throwing someone out an airlock. "Do 3 apex predator cubs just disappear from a maximum security enclosure?" Dr. Vexthul's translator struggled to keep up with his rapid, terrified chittering. "Feeding time! Everything normal. Put food in containment chamber, sealed properly, followed all protocols. Went to retrieve dishes 30 minutes later and—" He gestured helplessly at the empty enclosure, which looked like it had been designed to hold small starships rather than baby animals. Zulvex examined the containment unit with the eye of someone who'd seen every possible way security could fail. The quantum locks were intact. No signs of forced entry. No residue from cutting tools or explosive charges. The cubs had simply vanished. Security footage. Corrupted. All of it. Every camera in this sector went offline for exactly 18 minutes during feeding time. Of course it did. Because the universe apparently thought Zulvex's job wasn't challenging enough already. The security chief activated his comm unit, broadcasting to every guard on campus. "All units, code black. 3 Nightstalker cubs. Juvenile, but extremely dangerous. They're somewhere in the dormitory complex. I want every room, every closet, every maintenance shaft searched. Nobody goes anywhere alone. Nobody approaches them without full combat armor and backup." The response was immediate and professional, which was exactly what Zulvex expected from his team. What he didn't expect was the nervous laughter that started filtering through the communication channels as his officers began encountering the various alien species that called the dormitory home. "Sir," came the voice of Lieutenant Cricksnull from the third floor, "the crystalline students are, well, they've formed some kind of geometric prayer formation in the common area. They're humming at a frequency that's making my equipment malfunction." "Sir," reported Sergeant Velthar from the dining hall, "the Bruthen students have barricaded themselves in the kitchen. They're demanding we provide them with heavy plasma cannons before they'll come out." And from the lower levels, "Chief, the aquatic sector students have sealed their pool areas and are refusing to surface. They keep saying something about dry land death beasts in their bubble speak." Zulvex rubbed his temples with all four hands. This was exactly the kind of chaos that Nightstalkers thrived in. Panic, confusion, scattered prey. It was like setting up a buffet for the cubs. But there was one group of students who seemed remarkably unperturbed by the emergency announcement, and that bothered Zulvex more than he cared to admit. The humans. Now, humans were a relatively new addition to the Galactic University system. Their species had only been part of the galactic community for about 2 standard cycles, and their reputation was complicated. On one hand, they were undeniably intelligent, creative, and remarkably adaptable. On the other hand, they had this disturbing tendency to do things that made absolutely no sense from a survival perspective. Take John, for instance. The human exchange student had been at the university for 3 months now, and in that time he'd managed to befriend the cleaning drones. Vicious little machines that most species gave a wide berth. He'd been caught hand-feeding the cafeteria prep bots, despite their prominent warning labels about razor-sharp cutting implements. And just last week, security footage had captured him having what appeared to be a lengthy conversation with one of the automated maintenance units, complete with gestures and head nods as if the machine was actually responding. The other human students weren't much better. They seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to find danger and then do the exact opposite of what any sensible being would do. They petted things with warning labels. They ate food that was clearly marked as toxic to their species, just to see what it tastes like. And they had this bizarre habit of forming emotional attachments to the most inappropriate creatures and objects. But right now, with 3 baby-killing machines loose in the dormitory, Zulvex would take human weirdness over the panic that was gripping the rest of the campus. "All units, begin systematic search of residential areas," he commanded. "Start with common species quarters and work your way up to the human floors. And remember, Nightstalkers are ambush predators. They could be anywhere." As his teams began their methodical search, Zulvex couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. Nightstalker cubs didn't just escape from quantum-locked containment units. They didn't disable security systems with the precision of trained operatives. And they certainly didn't do it without leaving some kind of trace. Somewhere in the dormitory complex, 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous predators were hiding. And with each passing minute, as the artificial day cycle gave way to night, they would become more active, more aggressive, and infinitely more deadly. The hunt was about to begin. 2 hours into the search, Zulvex was beginning to understand why his predecessor had retired early to a nice, quiet monastery on the outer rim. His teams had swept through the common areas with military precision, finding nothing more dangerous than a group of tentacled philosophy students engaged in what they called existential meditation, but looked suspiciously like taking a nap. The dining hall had yielded only the Bruthen students, who emerged from their makeshift fortress, demanding to know why security hadn't issued them personal plasma cannons yet. The library was clear, unless you counted the fact that 3 floating brain students had apparently been there so long they'd started growing moss, which was both disgusting and probably a health violation. But it was when his teams reached the residential sector that things got interesting. "Sir, we've completed the crystalline dormitory wing," reported Lieutenant Crick Snull, and Zulvex could hear the relief in his voice. Students were very cooperative. They formed perfect geometric search patterns and helped us check every possible hiding spot. Their precision was actually quite impressive. "Aquatic sector is clear as well," came another report. Students provided detailed sonar scans of all water-accessible areas. If the cubs had gone swimming, we'd know about it. Even the notoriously territorial spiked carapace students had been helpful, using their natural armor plating to safely check areas that might have been too dangerous for unprotected security personnel. But as his teams worked their way up through the floors, Zulvex began to notice a pattern that made his mandibles click with unease. "Chief," came Sergeant Velthar's voice, tinged with confusion, "we just finished searching the mammalian sector. Found something weird in one of the rooms." "Define weird, Sergeant." "Well, sir, there was this collection of small, furry creatures from various worlds, all of them supposedly aggressive or venomous according to their species profiles. But they were just sitting there, calm. One of them was even purring. The student said she'd been collecting strays for her xenobiology thesis." Zulvex's headache was getting worse. "What species was the student?" "Human, sir." "Of course she was." "Sir," came another voice from a different floor, "we found a human student who's apparently been keeping a collection of those acid-spitting beetles from Kepler 9. Says they make good study buddies and help him focus. The beetles seem content." "And, sir," chimed in a third voice, "there's a human here who's somehow tamed one of those razor wire plants from the botanical department. It's growing in his window, and he claims it helps with the ambiance." Zulvex was starting to see a disturbing pattern. He pulled up the student files on his datapad, cross-referencing incident reports with species classifications. What he found made him question either his own sanity or the fundamental laws of nature. In the past 3 months, human students had been involved in no fewer than 23 incidents involving supposedly dangerous campus wildlife. In every single case, the creatures in question had somehow been rendered harmless. Not subdued, not contained, actually harmless, as if they'd forgotten they were supposed to be aggressive in the first place. Take John, for instance. His file read like a comedy of errors, if comedy involved repeatedly failing to get killed by things that should have turned him into a decorative smear on the wall. Week 1, caught attempting to pet a cleaning drone while it was in active sterilization mode. Drone malfunctioned and began following him around like a lost puppy. Week 3, found sharing his lunch with a prep bot in the cafeteria kitchen. When questioned, claimed the machine looked hungry. Somehow managed to avoid losing any limbs to its spinning blade attachments. Week 6, reported having lengthy conversations with various automated systems throughout the campus. When maintenance checked the systems, they found that their efficiency had improved by 30%. Week 9, discovered napping in the same room as a Venusian spike cat that had escaped from the xenobiology labs. Both human and spike cat appeared to be using each other as pillows. Spike cat later refused to leave human's vicinity for 3 days. "Sir," came Lieutenant Cricksnell's voice again, "we're reaching the human residential floors. How do you want us to proceed?" Zulvex paused, looking at the data streaming across his screen. Human students seemed to have this inexplicable ability to turn dangerous situations into whatever the opposite of dangerous was. It defied every principle of predator-prey relationships he'd learned in his training. "Proceed with caution," he finally ordered, "but Be prepared for the unexpected. Humans have a tendency to complicate situations. Complicate how, sir? Zulvex thought about how to explain it. How do you tell your subordinates that an entire species seemed to operate on the principle that if something was dangerous, the appropriate response was to try to make friends with it? Just don't assume anything is normal when dealing with human students, and if you find anything that seems impossible, report it immediately. As his teams began their sweep of the human residential floors, Zulvex found himself reviewing the psychological profiles that had been compiled on the species. The conclusions were both fascinating and terrifying. Humans, according to the xenopsychologists, suffered from what they termed inappropriate attachment syndrome. They had a disturbing tendency to form emotional bonds with creatures and objects that any rational being would avoid. This was apparently considered normal behavior for their species. They also exhibited something called neoteny response, which meant they found juvenile versions of nearly any creature, even dangerous ones, inherently appealing. This was theorized to be an evolutionary adaptation that helped them care for their own young, but had apparently generalized to include baby versions of apex predators. Most concerning of all, humans seemed to produce some kind of biochemical signal that had a calming effect on other species. The research was still preliminary, but early studies suggested that human presence could actually reduce stress hormones in aggressive creatures, which was all very interesting from an academic standpoint, but absolutely terrifying when you considered that 3 baby Nightstalkers were loose in a building full of humans who might think they were cute. "Sir," came a new voice over the comm, "we've reached John's floor, beginning systematic room-by-room search." Zulvex felt his stomach drop. If his suspicions were correct, if the patterns held true, then there was a very good chance that wherever those Nightstalker cubs were, they were probably having the time of their lives. "Proceed carefully," he ordered, grabbing his sidearm and heading for the elevator. "I'm coming up." Because if there was one thing Zulvex had learned in his career, it was that, when humans were involved, you could throw the rulebook out the nearest airlock and start improvising. And right now, with 3 baby-killing machines unaccounted for, improvisation was the last thing he wanted to be doing. The elevator ride to John's floor felt like the longest 3 minutes of Zulvex's career. His mind raced through possible scenarios, each one more improbable than the last. Best case, the cubs had found some hiding spot and were waiting for nightfall to begin their rampage. Worst case, they'd already found the human students, and the security team was about to walk into a massacre that would make the Battle of Proxima look like a peaceful debate. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded absurdly cheerful given the circumstances. The human residential floor looked exactly like every other dormitory floor in the complex. Long corridors lined with doors, soft lighting, the kind of institutional carpet that somehow managed to be both beige and offensive to the eye simultaneously. What was unusual was the complete lack of panic. "Sir," Lieutenant Crixnell whispered, "shouldn't the humans be more concerned? I mean, we announced a code black emergency 2 hours ago." Zulvex listened carefully. From behind various doors, he could hear the distinctive sounds of human students going about their normal evening routines. Someone was playing what sounded like music, though it involved more percussion than most species could tolerate. Another room emitted the low murmur of conversation. Somewhere, someone was actually laughing. Human psychological profiles indicate they have unusual threat assessment capabilities, Zulvex muttered, which was the polite way of saying that humans were apparently too stupid to be properly afraid of things that could kill them. They began their room-by-room search with military precision. The first few doors revealed exactly what you'd expect from college students: messy spaces filled with study materials, personal belongings, and the kind of creative disorder that suggested intellectual activity was taking place, just not necessarily in an organized fashion. The human students were cooperative, if puzzled by the intensity of the search. They stepped aside, answered questions politely, and seemed genuinely curious about what the security team was looking for. "Nightstalker cubs," said one student, a young female with bright blue hair that definitely wasn't a natural human color. "Oh, those are the really big cat things from the xenobiology display, right? They're adorable. Are they lost?" Zulvex's eye twitched. Adorable was not a word typically associated with apex predators. "They're extremely dangerous," he explained patiently, "capable of killing adult beings with minimal effort." The student looked thoughtful. "Huh. Well, if I see any lost baby animals wandering around, I'll let you know. Poor little things are probably scared and confused." This was exactly the kind of response that made Zulvex question whether humans had any survival instincts whatsoever. They continued down the corridor, each room yielding nothing more threatening than textbooks and questionable food choices, until they reached the door marked with John's student identification number. Zulvex paused outside, his hand hovering over the door controls. His instincts, honed by years of security work, were screaming that something was different about this room. Not wrong, exactly. Just different. "Sir?" Lieutenant Cricksnall asked quietly. "Do you hear that?" They listened carefully. From beyond the door came a sound that was both familiar and utterly out of place in this context. A low, rhythmic rumbling that could only be described as purring, Sergeant Velthar said in disbelief. "That sounds like purring." Zulvex activated his scanner, running a quick biological sweep of the room beyond. The readout made him blink all 4 eyes in succession, certain his equipment was malfunctioning. 3 large life forms. Definitely feline. Definitely Nightstalker cubs based on their biological signatures. And according to his scanner, their stress levels were so low, they were practically in hibernation mode. "Impossible," he muttered, running the scan again. Same results. He signaled his team to ready positions, though he was beginning to suspect that whatever was happening beyond that door, it wasn't going to require plasma weapons to resolve. The door slid open with a soft whisper. The scene that greeted them was so fundamentally wrong that it took Zulvex's brain several seconds to process what his eyes were seeing. John was sitting at his desk, a datapad in one hand and what appeared to be a sandwich in the other. He looked up as the security team entered, mild curiosity on his face, as if armed aliens bursting into his room was a perfectly normal occurrence. On his bed, his actual sleeping space where he was supposed to be safe and protected, were 3 Nightstalker cubs. Each one was roughly the size of a small shuttle, with midnight black fur and claws that gleamed like polished metal. They were curled up together in a pile of contentment, their massive forms somehow managing to fit on the human-sized mattress. One of them had its head draped over John's pillow. Another was using what appeared to be John's spare blanket as a nest. The third was lying on its back, all 4 paws in the air, looking like the most relaxed apex predator in the history of the galaxy. All 3 were purring. The security team stood frozen in the doorway, weapons raised but completely useless in the face of this, whatever this was. "Oh, hey," John said casually, taking a bite of his sandwich. "You guys looking for these 3? They wandered in a few hours ago, looking pretty lost. Seemed hungry and cold, so I figured I'd let them rest up a bit." Zulvex's mandibles worked silently for several seconds before his voice returned. "John, those are Nightstalker cubs." "Yeah? John reached over and scratched behind the nearest cub's ears. The creature's purring increased in volume, and it pressed its head against his hand like an oversized house cat. "They're pretty sweet. This one here," he indicated the cub using his blanket, "was shivering when he first came in. I think the air conditioning was too cold for him." They're apex predators," Sergeant Velthar managed to say. John looked puzzled. "Really? They seem more like big kittens to me. Look, watch this." He gently nudged the cub that was lying on its back. "Hey, buddy, can you move over? I need to get my textbook." The cub, this creature that had been bred for violence and hunting, made a small chirping sound and obligingly rolled to one side, allowing John to retrieve his textbook from under its massive form. "Thanks," John said, patting the cub's belly affectionately. Lieutenant Crixenall was running continuous scans, his equipment beeping frantically as it tried to make sense of the readings. "Sir, according to my instruments, their stress hormones are practically non-existent. Their heart rates are consistent with deep relaxation, and their brain activity suggests they're experiencing something analogous to contentment." "That's impossible," Zulvex said, though he was beginning to realize that impossibility seemed to be a relative concept where humans were involved. "Is it, though?" John asked, offering a piece of his sandwich to the nearest cub, who delicately took it with teeth that could have severed John's arm without effort. "I mean, they're just babies, right? Babies need warmth, food, and somewhere safe to sleep. Basic stuff." Zulvex watched in fascination and horror as John continued to treat 3 of the galaxy's most dangerous predators like they were harmless pets. And somehow, impossibly, illogically, contrary to every known principle of xenobiology, it was working. The cubs weren't just calm, they were happy. Anyone with eyes could see it. "How?" was all Zulvex could manage to ask. John shrugged. "They were sitting outside my door making these sad little crying sounds. What was I supposed to do? Ignore them?" The silence that followed this statement stretched on for what felt like several geological epochs. Zulvex found himself staring at a human who had just described the hunting calls of apex predators as sad little crying sounds, and had responded to them by opening his door. You opened your door," Zulvex said slowly, "when you heard Nightstalker vocalizations in the hallway?" "Well, yeah. They sounded upset." John reached over and gently stroked the head of the cub that was draped across his pillow. The creature made a soft, trilling sound and nuzzled closer to his hand. "This little guy here was the worst. He kept making these heartbreaking, whimpering noises." Lieutenant Crixenall was frantically checking his translation equipment. "Sir, those whimpering noises register on our audio analysis as hunting coordination calls. They were probably strategizing about how to breach his door." "Huh," John said thoughtfully. "That's interesting. They seemed more like 'please help us' sounds to me." Sergeant Velthar had given up on his scanner entirely, and was now just staring at the scene before him with the expression of someone whose worldview had just been thoroughly demolished. "They were hunting you," he said weakly. "They were setting up an ambush." "Were they?" John looked down at the cubs with genuine curiosity. "Hey guys, were you trying to hunt me?" The cub nearest to him opened one massive golden eye and made a sound that could charitably be called a chirp. It was the kind of sound that, in any other context, might have been adorable. The fact that it came from a creature with claws that could disembowel a battleship made it significantly less cute. Except, apparently, to John, who grinned widely. "See? He says no, though I'm not entirely sure that was actually communication or just a sleepy noise." "John," Zulvex said, trying to inject some authority into his voice, despite the fact that his entire understanding of predator behavior was currently crumbling around him. "I need you to very slowly move away from the cubs." "Why? They're comfortable." John looked genuinely puzzled by the request. "Besides, if I move, I'll disturb their nap. Look how peaceful they are." It was true. The three cubs were the picture of contentment, their massive forms somehow managing to look both imposing and utterly relaxed. Their breathing was slow and steady. Their claws were fully retracted. One of them had actually started drooling slightly onto John's spare pillow. "This is biologically impossible," Lieutenant Crixnell muttered, running yet another scan. "Nightstalkers don't form social bonds with other species. They don't exhibit pack behavior with non-Nightstalkers. They certainly don't nap with potential prey items." "Maybe they're not as antisocial as everyone thinks," John suggested. "I mean, look at them. They're clearly social creatures. They came here together. They're sleeping together. They've been sharing my food." "You fed them?" Zulvex's voice rose to what could generously be called a controlled shout. "Just part of my dinner. And some of those protein bars I got from the vending machine. They seemed really hungry." John gestured to a small pile of empty containers near his desk. "Growing cubs need lots of nutrition, right?" The security team exchanged glances that conveyed a mixture of disbelief, professional confusion, and the dawning realization that they were dealing with something completely outside their training parameters. "Sir," Sergeant Velthar said quietly, "according to the feeding schedule from the zoology department, these cubs haven't eaten in over 8 hours. They should be in full hunting mode by now." "Well, they're not hungry anymore," John said reasonably. "I made sure of that, though I think I need to hit the vending machines again. They ate pretty much everything I had." Zulvex was beginning to understand why his predecessor had retired early. "John, these creatures are designed by evolution to kill. Everything about them, their claws, their teeth, their muscle structure, their nervous system, exists for the sole purpose of turning other living beings into food." "Okay," John said agreeably. "But right now they're designed for napping, apparently." He pointed to the cub that was lying on its back. "Look at that belly. You can't tell me that's not the most relaxed predator you've ever seen." It was, in fact, exactly that. The cub's stomach rose and fell with the steady rhythm of deep sleep. Its paws twitched occasionally, suggesting it was dreaming about something pleasant, possibly chasing butterflies, though, given its species, more likely chasing small starships. "This shouldn't be possible," Lieutenant Crixnell said, more to himself than anyone else. "Every study, every behavioral analysis, every piece of research we have on Nightstalkers indicates they're solitary, aggressive, and incapable of forming emotional attachments." "Maybe the research is wrong," John suggested helpfully. "I mean, these guys are obviously capable of attachment. Look." He gently moved his hand away from the cub he'd been petting. Immediately, the creature made a small sound of protest and nudged its head back toward his palm. "See? He likes being petted. That's definitely attachment behavior." Zulvex watched in fascination as John resumed petting the cub, which immediately resumed its contented purring. The sound was so loud it was practically vibrating the walls, and yet somehow it was soothing rather than threatening. "How long have they been here?" he asked. John glanced at his chronometer. "About 3 hours? They showed up right after the emergency announcement went off. I figured they were probably scared by all the sirens and flashing lights." "They were scared," Sergeant Velthar repeated flatly. "The Nightstalker cubs were scared. Wouldn't you be? Loud noises, bright lights, Lots of people running around with weapons. That's got to be pretty overwhelming when you're just a baby. John's voice took on the tone people usually reserved for discussing actual babies. I think they just needed somewhere quiet and safe to hide. The security team stood in stunned silence, watching as John continued to treat three apex predators like they were oversized house cats. And the most disturbing part wasn't that he was doing it. It was that it was working. "Sir," Lieutenant Cricksnell said finally, "what are our orders? The cubs are contained, technically. They're not threatening anyone. They're not causing any damage. And they seem healthy." Zulvex stared at the scene before him. In all his years of security work, through combat zones and crisis situations and more kinds of chaos than he cared to remember, he had never encountered anything quite like this. A human student had somehow convinced three baby killing machines to take a nap in his bedroom. "I need to call in a specialist," he said finally. "This is beyond my expertise." "What kind of specialist?" Sergeant Velthar asked. "The kind that studies impossible things," Zulvex replied, reaching for his communicator. "Because this definitely qualifies." As he prepared to contact Dr. Melkari, he couldn't help but notice that one of the cubs had shifted position and was now using John's leg as a pillow. John didn't seem concerned about this development in Tifitri the slightest. Humans, Zulvex decided, were either the bravest species in the galaxy or the most foolishly optimistic. Possibly both. Dr. Melkari arrived 23 minutes later, which was impressive considering she'd been on the other side of campus when Zulvex's frantic communication reached her. She was a tall, elegant being from the Spiral Nebula colonies, with the kind of multiple doctoral degrees that made other academics weep with envy, and the practical experience that came from studying the galaxy's most dangerous creatures without getting eaten by them. She also had the distinction of being the only xenobiologist in the sector who specialized in impossible animal behavior, the kind of cases that made other scientists question their career choices. "Where are they?" she asked briskly, stepping into John's room with the confidence of someone who had faced down everything from acid-spitting serpents to gravity-warping predators and lived to publish papers about the experience. Then she stopped dead, her four eyes widening as she took in the scene. "By the 7 moons of Kepler," she breathed. "They're actually sleeping." "Told you it was impossible," Zulvex muttered. Dr. Melkari approached the bed slowly, pulling out a portable scanner that looked far more sophisticated than anything the security team carried. She ran it over the cubs from a safe distance, her expression shifting from skeptical to fascinated to deeply confused. "Stress hormones are practically non-existent," she murmured, reading the display. "Oxytocin levels are through the roof. Dopamine is elevated. These readings are consistent with bonding behavior." "Bonding with what?" Sergeant Velthar asked. Dr. Melkari looked at John, who was still casually scratching behind the ears of the nearest cub. "With him, apparently." "But that's impossible," Lieutenant Cricksnell protested. "Nightstalkers don't bond with other species. They barely tolerate their own kind outside of mating season." "Yes, well, apparently no one told them that." Dr. Melkari moved closer, her scanner beeping softly. "John, I need you to slowly move away from them so I can get better readings." "I really don't want to disturb their sleep," John said apologetically. "They had a pretty stressful day, what with escaping and then all the sirens and people chasing them around. I think they need the rest." Dr. Melkari blinked slowly. "You're concerned about their emotional well-being?" "Well, yeah. Wouldn't you be?" John looked genuinely surprised by the question. "I mean, they're just babies. Baby animals need comfort when they're scared or upset." These are not baby animals, Zulvex said firmly. These are juvenile apex predators. Same thing, really, John replied, with the kind of casual confidence that made career military personnel reach for their antacids. A baby is a baby, right? Dr. Melkari was frantically taking notes on her datapad. This is extraordinary. John, can you describe exactly what happened when you first encountered them? John settled back in his chair, careful not to disturb the cub that was using his leg as a pillow. Well, I was studying for my xenobiology exam when I heard these noises in the hallway. Sounded like crying, you know? Sad and scared. So I opened my door to see what was going on. And you saw 3 Nightstalker cubs, Dr. Melkari prompted. I saw 3 lost-looking baby animals, John corrected gently. They were huddled together by the elevator, making these pitiful sounds. The smallest one looked like he was shivering. Zulvex exchanged glances with his team. The smallest one was probably preparing to flank you, while the larger ones attacked from the front. Nah, he was definitely cold. Look. John pointed to the cub that was wrapped in his spare blanket. Soon as I brought them inside and warmed them up, the shivering stopped. Poor little guy was probably hypothermic. Dr. Melkari was running continuous scans now, her equipment painting detailed pictures of the cubs' biological states. Their body temperatures are optimal. Brain chemistry suggests deep contentment. Neural activity indicates they feel safe and protected. She paused, checking her readings again. John, what did you do when you brought them inside? Basic stuff. Checked to make sure they weren't hurt. Got them some food and water. Made sure they had a comfortable place to rest. John spoke as if this was the most natural thing in the galaxy. They seemed really grateful, kept making these sweet little chirping sounds. Those sweet little chirping sounds are typically vocalizations that Nightstalkers use to coordinate attacks, Dr. Melkari said absently, still focused on her scanner readings. Huh, they sounded more like, "Thank you," to me. The room fell silent except for the rumbling purrs of the 3 cubs and the soft beeping of Dr. Melkari's equipment. Outside, the campus was still in emergency lockdown, unaware that the crisis had been resolved by a human student who apparently thought apex predators were just misunderstood pets. Doctor, Zulvex said finally, can you explain what's happening here? Because everything I know about Nightstalker behavior says this situation should be impossible. Dr. Melkari put down her scanner and looked thoughtful. There are theories. Preliminary research suggests that humans produce certain biochemical signals, pheromones, possibly some kind of neural field, that can have a calming effect on other species. It's thought to be related to their remarkable success as a social species. You mean they smell calming? Sergeant Velthar asked. More than that. There's evidence that human presence can actually trigger parental or protective instincts in creatures that wouldn't normally exhibit such behavior toward other species. She gestured toward the cubs. These 3 aren't just calm. They're exhibiting classic comfort-seeking behavior. They trust him. But why? Lieutenant Cricksnall wanted to know. What is it about humans that makes dangerous predators act like housecats? Dr. Melkari smiled, the expression making her look younger despite her obvious expertise. That's the fascinating part. Humans seem to have evolved not just to be social with their own kind, but to be universally social. They can form emotional connections with almost any species, under almost any circumstances. And somehow, that ability appears to be contagious. Contagious how? Zulvex asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. The creatures they bond with start to exhibit human-like social behaviors. They become more cooperative, more affectionate, more trusting, She pointed to the cubs. These three have essentially adopted John as a member of their pack. In their minds, he's family now. John looked pleased by this assessment. That's nice. I like having family around. The security team stood in stunned silence, processing the implications of what they'd just heard. Humans didn't just tame dangerous creatures. They somehow convinced them to become social, caring beings. So what do we do now? Zulvex asked. The cubs are supposed to be in containment. Dr. Melkari ran another scan, noting the cubs' continued state of peaceful contentment. Well, they're certainly contained, and they're healthier and more relaxed than they've ever been in captivity. From a scientific standpoint, this is invaluable data. From a safety standpoint, Sergeant Velthar prompted, they're probably safer than they would be in traditional containment. Nightstalker cubs have been known to develop behavioral problems in isolation. These three are clearly thriving. At that moment, there was a gentle knock on the door. "Security team," came a nervous voice from the hallway. "This is Dr. Vexthul from the zoology department. I'm here to retrieve the escaped specimens." Zulvex looked at John, then at the cubs, then at Dr. Melkari. "This should be interesting." Dr. Vexthul entered the room carrying a set of quantum restraints and a portable containment unit. He took one look at the scene and nearly dropped his equipment. They're sleeping," he stammered. "Yep," John said cheerfully. "Had a good meal and a nice nap. They seem much happier now." Dr. Vexthul approached cautiously, his restraint equipment trembling in his hands. "I need to return them to the containment facility." The moment he activated the quantum restraints, all three cubs opened their eyes and fixed him with the kind of look that had made Nightstalkers the apex predators of 6 different star systems. A low, warning growl rumbled from the largest cub's throat. "Whoa, hey," John said quickly, placing a calming hand on the growling cub's head. "It's okay, guys. Nobody's going to hurt you." The growling stopped immediately. The cubs looked from Dr. Vexthul to John, and back again, clearly torn, between their protective instincts and their trust in their human friend. "Perhaps," Dr. Melkari suggested diplomatically, "we could arrange for John to visit the cubs regularly. It would be valuable for ongoing behavioral studies." John brightened considerably. "I'd like that. They're good company." As if in response to his words, one of the cubs stretched luxuriously and padded over to nuzzle against John's shoulder. The gesture was so gentle, so utterly unpredator-like, that even Dr. Vexthul seemed to relax slightly. "Very well," he said, deactivating his restraint equipment, "but I'm recommending that we redesign their containment environment. Obviously, our current understanding of Nightstalker needs is incomplete." As the various officials made arrangements for the cubs' return to the zoology department, Zulvex found himself wondering about the broader implications of what he'd witnessed. If humans could turn apex predators into gentle companions, what did that mean for the galaxy's understanding of interspecies relations? 3 hours later, as the campus emergency lockdown was finally lifted, Zulvex sat in his office writing what would become the most unusual incident report in galactic university history. The cubs had been successfully returned to the zoology department, though they'd required significant coaxing, and had insisted on carrying several of John's belongings with them, apparently as comfort items. John had been given a special commendation for innovative crisis resolution and a standing invitation to assist with future, difficult animal cases. And Zulvex had developed a new appreciation for human unpredictability. 6 months later, when John graduated and prepared to return to Earth, the Nightstalker cubs, now fully grown but still remarkably gentle creatures, had to be sedated to prevent them from following him to the spaceport. The final entry in Zulvex's report was both simple and profound. Human students should perhaps be considered less of a security risk and more of a security asset. Recommend further study of human-animal bonding capabilities for potential diplomatic applications. After all, if humans could convince baby-killing machines to take naps, imagine what they might accomplish with slightly more cooperative species. The universe, Zulvex reflected, had just become a much more interesting place. But the story didn't end there. Within a week of the incident, John had somehow become the unofficial animal consultant for the entire university. Students from across the galaxy began bringing him their problematic pets, creatures that were too aggressive, too antisocial, or too dangerous for normal handling. There was Nixandra, the crystalline student whose pet rock borer had been terrorizing her dormmates by chewing through walls. After an afternoon with John, the creature learned to channel its digging instincts into creating decorative sculptures instead of structural damage. Brulcax brought him a Venusian thorn lizard that had been refusing to eat and hissing at everyone who came near. John spent 20 minutes talking to it in soothing tones while hand-feeding it protein cubes. The lizard ended up following him around campus like a loyal dog. Even the cafeteria staff started consulting him about the prep bots when they got too aggressive during meal preparation. Apparently, John's presence made the machines more cooperative and less likely to accidentally slice important things, like supply deliveries or the occasional student who got too close during busy periods. Zulvex watched all of this with a mixture of admiration and existential dread. Humans, it seemed, didn't just pack bond with dangerous animals. They pack bonded with everything. Machines, plants, other students, probably the campus itself if given enough time. It was simultaneously the most useful and most terrifying ability he'd ever witnessed.